Hello, my name is Polly Jones. I'm Professor of Russian at the University of Oxford and I'm a Fellow of University College or UNIV. I also teach Russian students at Brasenose. This video is about literature as part of the overall Russian degree at Oxford. I hope you might have already had the chance to watch some of the more general videos about applying for modern languages at Oxford and applying for Russian at Oxford. My colleagues have also made some videos about linguistics as part of the Russian degree and also about language learning and teaching as part of the degree. So this is about the literary elements of the course. And if you've watched those videos, or even if you haven't, but have read up a little bit about the Oxford course, you might already have a sense that literature is not the only thing by any means that we teach as part of the Modern Languages degree here at Oxford, but it is at the heart of the course. We believe that literature plays a very important role in improving your language. You read all of the literary texts in the original, starting with shorter texts and moving up to longer novels and so on as the degree goes on. And that helps to improve your language and for you to reach full fluency by the end of your degree. We also believe that literature can offer a unique window on history and politics. Now, as far as why you might wish to study Russian literature, more specifically, I'm sure you all have your own reasons already. Perhaps you've read some Russian literature in translation. Perhaps you're doing an A-level in Russian and you've come across some Russian literary texts already through that. Perhaps you're doing history and you've become interested in Russian history. And these are all great reasons for wanting to delve more deeply into Russian literature once you get to university. There are all sorts of reasons why Russian literature is a great thing to study at university and specifically at Oxford, where literature is at the heart of the course. Here are just some of them. Firstly, Russian literature is a rich and ancient literature, and Oxford is one of very few universities worldwide where you can study Russian literature from its beginnings right up to the 21st century, to the present day. It had a particularly intensive development of a world-class literary tradition from the early 19th century onwards, writers such as Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov becoming world famous and very widely translated, and often one of the first things that motivates students to become interested in Russian literature and to become interested in applying to study it at university is because they've read one of the great 19th century novels in translation, for example, and that's something that we love to discuss as part of the admissions process. This intensive development of a world-class literary tradition has, of course, continued in the 20th and 21st century, as, for example, shown in the number of Nobel Prize winners there are who've written in Russian, including Pasternak, Solzhenitsyn, and most recently, the Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich. These are all authors who you may well read and study in detail as part of the Oxford degree. It's also worth noting, as I've already mentioned, that, of course, alongside this intensive development of literature, the modern period also sees particularly dramatic historical and political changes, again, with a global significance. Very intensive modernisation in the 19th century, the Russian Revolution, of course, of 1917, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and Russia's continuing important role on the world stage today. These are all things that the Russian degree course here will explore, and it will explore how writers engage with these historical and political changes. Russian writers and the Russian intelligentsia more generally are often, although not always, of course, very interested in questions of history and politics and Russia's national identity. And often literature had a very special role in Russian society as a substitute for public discussion, although often political points were disguised to get past the censor. These are all things that we will explore through the Russian literature course here. It's also worth noting in a more sort of comparative vein that Russian literature is very rewarding to study alongside other literatures. Many people, although not all students, of course, take Russian in conjunction with another language and literature or with another subject, including English or history. And as part of that, you can gain a comparative perspective on how, for example, Russian literary theorists have contributed to the broader field of literary theory. And of course, there are also There's also very extensive possibilities to compare literary movements in Russia with how they played out in other literatures and cultures, such as Romanticism, Realism, Modernism, and Postmodernism. So this, again, is a very rewarding way to study Russian literature, to place it in comparison with the other literature that you may be studying. Now, why study Russian literature at Oxford more specifically? Well, as I've already mentioned, our syllabus is extremely broad, as well as offering the possibilities of deep study of particular authors, particular literary movements, and particular themes that you might become interested in. However, we recognise that when you arrive in Oxford, and indeed when you apply to Oxford, it's unlikely that you'll have read a great deal of Russian literature at all, and certainly we don't expect students to have read a great deal in the original. It's enough at the admission stage that you perhaps have read a couple of works in translation. So one of the first things that we do if you come to Oxford as part of your already with a Russian A-level is that already in the first year you'll be plunged into an introduction to the major literary movements and key authors from the 18th to the late 20th century through study of a series of short prose texts and poems in your first year. If you come in as part of the beginner's Russian course, the study of those same texts will take place as part of your second year, which is spent abroad in Yaroslavl. So, but if you come in with a Russian A-level, this will be the first year course. And through that, you'll get a sense of a number of major writers and also a number of major genres of literature. After that, though, once you've got through the first year exams, which is the last time that you'll sit exams until the end of your fourth year, you then have a very wide choice of options from the second to the fourth year of your course. And you get to choose your own route through what we call the final honours school, or the sort of main part of the literature course. But they'll probably include some of the following. So typically at the core of the literature degree is what's called a period paper. These are broad papers which explore several centuries each of literary history, and they might be medieval, early modern, or modern to the present day. And there's quite a lot of scope within those papers to choose topics and authors that interest you individually in discussion with your tutors. You might also choose, and many students do, to specialise in particular authors that you might have become interested in as part of the period paper, and you want to delve into that in a little bit more depth. So author papers specialise in individual authors, major poets, prose writers, dramatists from across the modern period. They might include writers such as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, poets such as Tsvetaeva, or modern writers such as Bulgakov or Petrushevskaya. You might also choose to take more specialist papers in, for example, theatre or film, or themes that you become interested in, such as gender and sexuality. There are specialist papers that you can take on all of those themes. If you're doing some of the joint schools degrees, that is degrees such as history and Russian or Russian and Oriental studies, you might be interested in taking what's called a bridge paper, where you compare and you bring together both disciplines in a research paper of your own choice. But even if you're not taking a joint school, there is still the possibility of writing a kind of mini dissertation or an extended essay on a topic of your choice that you choose and which you are individually supervised to write in the final year of your degree, but which you might start to research during your year abroad. And indeed, the topic for that might arise out of your travels and out of particular historical, political, artistic issues that you've become interested in and haven't had a chance to study through the kind of core literary papers of the degree. So, as you can see, there's a very wide range of papers that you can take, but typically students would take, for example, a period paper, an author paper, and perhaps an extended essay, and also perhaps a linguistic paper or a medieval literature paper. So whatever choice of paper you make, and I don't think any two students do the same choice of papers, there is still, broadly speaking, we study all of them through roughly the same methods. So you will go to lectures as part of your degree course, but the sort of main part of your study will be reading and independent study and writing. So you're expected to read all of the set texts in the original, and largely that takes place in the vacations so that you're not scrambling to read them during term time. And that reading in the original, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, is one of the things that we feel really most helps students to develop great fluency in the language. So you'll read the text in the original before the term starts, and during the terms, during our very intensive 8-week terms, you'll typically write usually one essay a week. You'll go off to research it independently using college and university libraries, and you'll be set a topic by your tutor, and you'll write up an essay on that, or it might be a commentary, a sort of a piece of close reading of a particular literary passage. Once you've handed in your essay, that will be marked by your tutor, and then you'll meet with your tutor individually, or more usually in a group of 2 to 3 students, for an hour of discussion, not only of your essay, but also of broader issues arising out of it. You might do some group work, you might do some extra close reading in class, and you'll be taught either by your college tutor or by a variety of other specialists that suit the particular choice of topics. So this tutorial is really the heart of the week, but obviously around that you'll also be taking language classes, you'll be attending lectures, but most literature students find that they do spend quite a lot of each week researching, writing, and then attending the tutorial about the particular literature essay. So then, what sort of ways might we study literature as part of the degree? Well, I've just given you here an example of a short passage that is a way into some of the things that we might discuss both in our essay writing and our commentary writing, and also as part of tutorial exercises. So I'd like you to pause the video here and read this extract. This is from the opening of a very famous novella that you might well have read in translation already, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, first published in the Soviet Union 1962, and perhaps most notable not only as the debut work of Solzhenitsyn, who went on to become a leading figure of 20th century literature, but also as one of the first works to talk about the Soviet labour camp system, or the Gulag. So perhaps if you could pause your video just to read through this text, and then we'll come back to thinking about how we might pull apart this text in our writing and in tutorial discussion. So I hope you've had a chance to read it. I've put the text on this slide here as well. So some of the questions that we might think about when approaching a literary text in this way. First of all, as you can see, as I mentioned, this is the opening to the novella. So it's our first introduction to the setting of the novella and to its characters, and in this case, in particular, the prisoners, although there is also a guard who appears as well. So the first question we might ask is, how does it show this prison and its routine? Does it show in any sense yet the Gulag as a whole? What we can see here already in these opening lines is that this is a very cold environment, and that we're inside the prisoners' dormitory. And we instantly get a sense of how cold it is, how dark and how bleak. But we don't get very much sense yet of the broader prison camp as a whole, the territory of the prison. We're very much still inside. It's the beginning of the day. And we don't yet get a sense of whether this is going to be a work about the broader network of the Gulag. But as I've said, we already get a very strong, almost visceral sense of how cold and challenging an environment this is. We're also introduced already in this passage to the person who in the title of the work is called Ivan Denisovich, that is his first name and his patronymic, or his father's name, which is a formal way to address someone in Russian. But here he's called Shukov, he's named by his surname. And we already start to get a sense of how he feels about being in prison. Of course, we see that he's a prisoner, he's in the barracks along with some other prisoners. But what we see already here is that he is reluctant to get up, that he is very preoccupied with the cold, both already very understandable feelings, given that we've already been told that there's very thick ice, it's very frosty. Why would anyone want to get up and start work in this environment? But we also get a sense immediately that the novella starts that this is a prisoner who is trying to make the best of the situation that he finds himself in. And also that despite the prison clearly having a routine, waking up very early, that this is just one sort of element of the prisoner's routine, that Zhukov here is already thinking of ways in which he can make some of the time within this one day his own, and perhaps to sort of bend the rules by earning a bit of money on the side, by doing some odd jobs. So he already seems like somebody who's ingenious, enterprising, who shows a degree of initiative. So again, he's not a dehumanized prisoner, he's already very individualized. And this is a really key point in the novella as a whole, as the name suggests. Another sort of thematic question that we might already start to think about when reading this passage is what the plot will be. Is there a plot here? I think probably not. I think this is largely description so far of the setting, of the character, and of his attitude to the setting in which he finds himself. And this might lead us to expect that, and the title as well might lead us to expect that actually this work might not have a great deal of plot, that it might instead be a very detailed description of this one day. And that might make us wonder whether this one day is typical of the prisoner experience, whether it's meant to be in some ways a microcosm of the Gulag, and what are the advantages of showing prison life minute by minute? Perhaps it allows us to really enter into the mentality of prisoner life and to empathise with the prisoner. And this is a really important point because for the preceding 30 years or so, Gulag prisoners had been taboo as a subject of Soviet literature and had been really sort of dehumanized by the Soviet regime. So here we have a writer who instead is seeking to emphasize their individuality, their humanity, and to make us empathize with the experience of being in prison and to really sense the kind of texture of life in this prison system. A last sort of thematic point that we might explore as part of our tutorial discussion is whether there's already a sense in which this work is not just about the Soviet prison, but also about human identity more broadly. Does it raise questions of how people generally might try to cope and survive in brutal conditions? Does it suggest that people can remain themselves even in these dehumanizing, de-individualizing conditions? And I think we already have a sense of Zhukov doing that. Another set of questions that we would seek to explore in our writing about this passage and in the discussion in the tutorial would be about form, literary form and style. Why choose the novella form? Why is a short form good for trying to evoke the prisoner experience? Perhaps it's particularly good at evoking a kind of dense experience and really giving us a lot of detail of how prisoners live from minute to minute. But at the same time, perhaps it avoids looking like it's making any kind of bigger political comments about this system. What's the narrative perspective here? Well, we've already talked about how we are already being encouraged to kind of put ourselves in the prisoner's shoes, to identify with his mentality of wanting to earn a little bit on the side. And that's done here through a third-person perspective, but one that seems to be blended already with the individual prisoner's perspective. As the novella goes on, and we would explore this through sort of detailed linguistic analysis, we can see how Zhukov's perspective blends with this third-person perspective, and often his particular forms of language, which are a peasant idiom, lots of prison slang, blends with this more neutral style of Russian that we largely see here, and again poses questions about what the appropriate language is to try to render the experience of the typical ordinary prisoner through this system, and why, again, that might be a challenge to what Soviet literature was ideally supposed to do. Another set of questions that we would explore would be historical and political questions. How on earth was a work about the Soviet Gulag publishable in the Soviet Union? What were the circumstances? They were actually very complicated, as perhaps you might already know for this particular novella. It required very top-level permission. It almost didn't get published. But also it became very quickly a very controversial work. And indeed, the broader theme of prison became a very controversial and, again, taboo theme by the end of the 1960s. It went much more into what we call samizdat, or unofficial publishing. The broadest set of questions that we might explore, and this is something which we could explore through the author papers or through the period paper, would be how this work fits within Solzhenitsyn's broader career. So we could explore that through the author paper syllabus by reading other novels and works by him. But also how the prison theme is developed across other literature, both before Solzhenitsyn and after him as well. And that might be a question particularly well suited to the period paper. So just to end, I wanted to just indicate some of the comparisons that we could make once we've really sort of delved into the close reading of that passage. We might also want to broaden out, and the literature course really enables us to do that in several different directions. So as I mentioned, something that you might do as a result of becoming interested in this text is to want to read more works by Solzhenitsyn, more works that he wrote about the Gulag, the most famous and longest of which, or one of the longest of which, is his work In the First Circle. He also wrote a very long documentary historical account called the Gulag Archipelago, which again we might wish to compare with the much shorter novella One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. We might also want to compare Solzhenitsyn's literary, ostensibly fictional work with something more documentary or autobiographical, such as Yevgenia Ginsburg's famous two works about her time in the Gulag, Journey into the Whirlwind. This is a more documentary text, but it has a great deal of literary qualities that we might want to analyse and that we could analyse as part of the period paper, for example. We might also do some translation work of this kind of documentary text. We could also compare, perhaps as part of the period paper, we could compare Ivan Denisovich with a very unusual, very different perspective on the prison offered by a samizdat work of fiction from the same period, from the 60s, Faithful Ruslan by Georgy Vladimov, which looks at the prison camps through the perspective of a camp dog and fascinatingly explores these same issues of obedience versus resistance or defiance through looking at a service dog in the camps. So again, we can see how narrative perspective is really important to how the Gulag is represented. And finally, just a much more contemporary indication of how the Gulag and the prison literature theme continues to develop. We could also look, again, as part of the period paper or as part of an extended essay, at how the Gulag theme has exploded again into Putin-era literature. One of the biggest literary works of the 2010s is this novel Zuleika, in Russian called Zuleika Opens Her Eyes by Guzel Yakhina, one of the bestsellers of 2017, widely translated, now made into a film as well. And this offers a new perspective on what might seem a theme that's been treated a great deal in the 20th century, but there are still new perspectives to be offered. And in this case, this is a writer from Tatarstan whose main protagonist is a female Muslim in the Gulag. And again, this has become popular for very intriguing reasons in contemporary Russia. So this is another work that you could very well study as part of your literary study here. So I hope this video has given you some sense of the sheer breadth of our literature course here, the many different ways in which we study literature, from close reading right through to these broader questions of literary history and history and politics itself. And I hope you'll be encouraged to apply to us, and I hope that we might meet you